All right, well, let's get started. So welcome to session number 4 out of 5, it turns out, we're going to have in this workshop. And this one is where we do a deeper dive into post-processing. And that's by popular demand. I've had multiple requests from people to see more detail about post-processing methods, and I'm happy to do that. I could talk all week about it.
Turn your volume down on your
It's
sign.
it's down all the way.
There's feedback.
Uh,
I hear the echo coming.
Yeah, I don't know, but my speakers are muted.
I'm
Hang on, I'll double check and make sure, but yes, my speakers, it has a little X next to them. It claims they're muted.
okay. Keep going. Sorry.
Okay, anywho, as I say, I had multiple requests for more discussion of post-processing, more detail about post-processing. So hopefully this will address at least some of that. And as always, don't hesitate to interrupt and ask questions. I want to make sure we don't leave anybody behind. And that includes you, Mary Lisa, if hopefully we'll be able to hear you if you need to interrupt and ask a question. So let me go ahead and move on here. And I'm showing all of my slides via Photoshop this time rather than PowerPoint, because that way I don't have to switch back and forth between different windows to share, which was dragging us down a bit last time. So here's slide number 2. This is just a summary of our 5 sessions. This is session number 4. And I don't yet have a date for session number 5. It's going to be either the 2nd or 3rd Saturday in January. But Judy Kernow is working on getting the room here reserved for that.
The 13th, if that's 13th, it can't be on the 13th.
Oh, okay.
We have a learning session on the 13th.
Oh, okay. In that case, it'll probably be the 20th. Judy is supposedly taking care of that. I spoke with her number of days ago. So I'll have to keep you posted as to when that will be. Anywho, moving on. These are the topics I intend to talk about today. First of all, layers and actions are pretty important in general in post-processing images, not just infrared images. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the basics of those, how to do them. Some people are more familiar than others, I think, with those things. So for those who are already familiar, bear with us for a little while, and we'll get past that fairly soon. But I want to make sure, as I say, that we don't leave anyone behind. So starting with layers. Think of the old days of film photography when we used to shoot slides, okay? And think of how you made composites in those days, if you ever tried this. What you would do is you would take 2 or more slides and sandwich them together, right? And you could make a composite that way. It was a very crude, primitive way of doing it, but you could do it that way. And actually professional illustrators and people like that spent many hours doing that sort of thing to create slides, in academia, for example, for color-coded slides and things like that. So it's not a totally foreign concept, but it's much more sophisticated in Photoshop. You can do the same basic thing. You can create composites by sandwiching 2 images together by 2 adjacent layers, but you can do a lot more than that with it as well. So there are 2 types of layers in Photoshop. One is called a fill layer, and that's a second layer, just like your original image, which is usually called the base layer, that contains a picture, contains an image, it contains pixels. And so you can put that on top of the original image, and if you don't do anything else, then that'll just override the original image. You won't see the original image, you'll just see that second layer. But you can change that. You can mask away parts of that second layer. You can control how intensely it's displayed by a process called opacity, a slider called opacity. So you can blend it into that original image using another fill layer and create a composite that way. And that's one way I often use layers, and you'll probably find yourself doing that as well. Second type of layers is called an adjustment layer. And that's a layer that doesn't actually contain pixels of its own. What it contains instead is an adjustment similar to ones, in fact, identical to ones that you've probably already been using without layers in Photoshop if you don't routinely use layers. So converting something to black and white, doing contrast and brightness adjustments, color adjustments, things like that, those can all be done via layers rather than just making adjustments on your original image layer, the baseline layer, which is kind of the default way of doing it. Layers are stacked, and you can stack as many of them as you want, literally dozens or hundreds of them. And I don't know if I've ever gotten up into the hundreds range, but I have gotten into the dozens range plenty of times. You can stack them as high as you want in your layer stack, and they are incredibly powerful. And I will start telling you about why they're so powerful on the next slide here. Here are the advantages, some of them. I got more than one slide's worth, but here are some of the advantages of using layers. First and foremost, they're non-destructive. You can put a layer on top of your original image, manipulate that layer to your heart's content without ever changing a pixel in your original image. So if you don't like what you did, no problem. Just delete that extra layer and you're back to where you started. You've never altered your original image. That's powerful in its own right. You can readjust them anytime you want to. If you put a few layers in a stack and discover that you don't quite like the result because that brightness adjustment that you made 3 or 4 layers down in your stack isn't quite what you wanted, no problem. Go back to that layer and tweak the brightness. You can do that anytime you want. So that's very powerful as well. And again, it's non-destructive. It doesn't in any way alter the original image. So you can always go back to those original pixels. You haven't damaged them or tweaked them in any way. The effect can be altered, as I say. You can not only readjust it, you can turn a given layer on and off, and you can control its intensity, the amount, the degree to which it's displayed or the degree to which it affects your final image through the opacity slider. So you can add in as much or as little of that as you want. They can be grouped and thus controlled together, and that's very powerful when you're creating different images or different versions of an image. For example, you may have one set of adjustments that you use to make a print, and another set of adjustments that you use to display something online. And you can put those adjustments in 2 separate groups of layers, turn one or the other on, depending on where you're going to share or how you're going to share that image. Layers are also handy because you can easily share them amongst multiple images. You can, for example, and I do this fairly often actually, if you want to convert an image to black and white, using a black and white adjustment layer, you can do that with one image and tweak your black and white settings until you get it just right. And then suppose you have a whole family of images, maybe from a single photo shoot, where you want to apply exactly the same black and white conversion. No problem. Just copy that black and white layer into each of those other images, and you've got exactly the same black and white settings. Very easy to do. Yes, Sherry.
Does that work with Nick layer? I mean, if you bring a Nick SilverFlex Pro comes in as a layer, can you then copy that as you've got that item?
Probably not, unless Nick, and I'm not sure if this is true or not. If Nick supports what do they call them? Smart layers, smart objects. Yeah, they call them smart objects.
This for smart objects.
And in that case, you may be able to copy that smart object layer into a different image and get the same settings.
You can also save the adjustment stuff that you do in SilverFlex or Color Effects as your own
Your own preset, yeah.
Preset.
Yeah, that's true as well.
But I mean, what you were just talking about, like for this custard shoot,
Mhm.
there's several of the images, because John took several images that are very similar.
Right.
That would be really good once we created one of these
Mhm.
pictures with that particular Silver Effects Pro. Once we got to the stage of using Silver Effects Pro.
Yeah.
I didn't ever know that you could do that. I've always had to go back in and recreate it.
Yeah.
So that's a.
I don't know for sure. I haven't tried that, so I don't know for sure if it will work, but it might. It's worth trying.
Caveat though is that,
Can you repeat some of the questions?
so whatever you move from one image to another will probably carry you forward the pixels from the image that.
Oh, yeah.
Now, that can be used to affect,
Yeah.
if you in fact want to do them on top of the image, or the
Yeah.
information from that one image to another and we're play around with it. I've done that.
You said save the preset, which is something. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, I would do a preset.
Yeah.
It's
So-
useful, or within Photoshop, if you've used a NIC filter on one image and you go to the next image of the same family, what you do is you do file, and then at the top of that list is whatever the last image that you use, for the last filter that you use. So I use the total contrast filter a lot. So I will do a full total contrast on one image, and then all I do is just put another using that and filter last filter. Is actually.
I like about you during break about getting more specific about that.
Okay.
Let me interrupt here for a moment if I could. You probably couldn't hear it because I could barely hear it, but Mary Lisa asked me to repeat the questions because she's not hearing what you guys say. So Mary Lisa, the question that Sherry asked originally was, if you have applied a black and white conversion via a NIC tool, Silver Effects Pro, can you then copy that image layer, that Silver Effects Pro layer into a different image and get the same Silver Effects Pro setting? The gist of the answer is probably not, because that Silver Effects Pro image or layer still contains the original pixels from the image where you first did it. So it probably won't just copy the Silver Effects Pro settings into the new image. The better way of doing that is to create a setting in Silver Effects Pro when you're using it that records the settings you used, and then you can easily go back to Silver Effects Pro and apply that to additional images as you process them. It's not quite as efficient as copying adjustment layers between images in Photoshop, but it does save you some time. So did that make sense, Mary Lisa?
Yes, thank you very much.
Sure. All right, so let's move on. Ready for our next slide here, I think. Let me go to that. Here are some more advantages of using layers. They can be masked, which means you're if you've copied a fill layer, or if you created a fill layer in an image, but you only want to apply a part of that to your original image, no problem. You can put a mask on it to decrease or eliminate the visibility of portions of that new fill layer and only include the parts of it that you want. Masking is a very complex subject in Photoshop. Not going to try and cover it here, but that's one of the additional advantages of using layers in Photoshop. Another somewhat more subtle advantage of layers is that they record what you've done with a given image. They record at least some of the steps, not all of them necessarily, but some of the steps that you used, and typically the major steps that you've used to create your final result are recorded in your layers if you're using layers to apply all of those adjustments. And that means you can go back, years later and look at those layers and say, that's how I did this. And that's very handy sometimes for me too, because I certainly don't remember everything. So are there any downsides to using layers? And the only one I could think of for purpose of this slide is they increase the size of your image files, especially those fill layers, because they contain separate pixels in their own right. And any masks that you add to a layer in Photoshop, those are also effectively fill layers. The mask is just another set of pixels, so that adds to your image size as well, your file size. Other than that, though, I couldn't think of any other downsides to using layers. So let me ask, are there any questions about that before we move on? Hearing none, let's move on. They are, yeah, Sherry observed they're your best friend, and I certainly agree they're one of my best friends, not the only one, but they are very useful, very, very useful. Okay, so how to add a layer. You open the layers panel, and I'll actually demonstrate this in a moment. But you open the layer panels by going to the window menu and then click layers. To add a new fill layer, you click the plus icon at the bottom of that layers panel. For a new adjustment layer, you click the little half circle icon at the bottom. And I think the next slide illustrates that. This is what the layers panel looks like. First of all, they call it a layers palette sometimes. And I just have arrows here at the bottom showing you where the new fill layer button is and where the adjustment layer is. If you click the adjustment layer button, and you'll see me do this later on during the demos, but if you click that adjustment layer icon down at the bottom, you get a choice of about 10 or 15 different layer types you can add, adjustment layer types you can add. And to be strictly honest and keep myself honest here, 3 of those types aren't actually adjustment layers, they're fill layers. You can put a solid color or a gradient or a pattern in a layer via that button as well, or that icon as well. And those aren't adjustment layers, those are fill layers. But most of the choices you'll get when you click that icon are for adjustment layers. So moving on here. Now we're ready to turn to actions. And an action is basically a recording. If those of you who have used Excel or Microsoft Word a lot may well have encountered what they call macros. A macro is a set of commands that you can record and then play back. So you can record the actions while you perform some operation, say formatting a paragraph or something. And if you record those specific steps as a macro, then you can go to the next paragraph, run that macro, and apply the same adjustments to that next paragraph. And an action is very much like that in Photoshop. It records the steps you've used to do some sequence of operations, and then you can replay those steps on something else, or you can replay them on the same thing for that matter if you want to. Very handy. It's sort of analogous to a computer program, but strictly speaking, it's not really a program, because you don't actually write it, with a language that gets compiled or executed or anything. But it's very powerful, very, very, very useful. It's not hard to get started using them either. People for both layers and actions, there's sort of a barrier that people are sometimes reluctant to approach them because it just seems like new territory or something. But they're actually not hard to get started with at all, and they can save you huge amounts of time. The other bonus benefit here that I list is they save you from making mistakes. If there's something you do that involves a lot of individual steps, then if you record those steps as an action, you'll never get them wrong again. They'll always get executed exactly the way you executed them when you recorded them. And it's even better than that because you can actually alter the execution. There are ways to alter the execution of those steps while you're running an action, which makes them even more flexible. So as I mentioned with layers, actions are a great way to remember how you did something because you can repeat it in the future. You can repeat it very effortlessly But equally importantly, perhaps, is if you've recorded some esoteric technique for processing an image in an action, then you don't have to remember that esoteric technique anymore. All you have to do is look up that action and it's recorded there. You can read it.
So you accidentally delete it.
Well, that's true. And that's a hazard, yes. That is a hazard. Photoshop remembers the actions that you currently have loaded. So if you exit from Photoshop and then bring up Photoshop again, it'll show you the same actions that you already had loaded when you close the program. But if for some reason you and this has happened to me, in fact, there was one notorious episode a few years ago where Adobe introduced a new version of Photoshop that didn't carry your actions over from the prior version when you installed it. And well, they earned the animosity of a lot of people when they did that, myself included. So they've stopped doing it that way. They give you an option now to bring presets and other things over to the new version when you install the new version, but they're
They add actions to the test. I look sometimes at the actions, find that I got a whole pile of actions, I never asked an action.
they ship Photoshop with a few default actions that they provide. And I never use those, so I've never paid much attention. But if you open a new version of Photoshop on a new machine, like this is my brand new laptop here, and it came with a few actions when I first installed Photoshop on it. It came with a few actions of theirs. So that may be what you're seeing. I don't know. But the other handy thing about actions is when you record them, you can also save them. You have to do it explicitly and manually. It doesn't automatically save them anywhere that will do you that will always protect you from accidentally losing them. So it's a very good idea to back up your actions by saving them to a hard drive that's in a place that's independent of Adobe's file system, so that you can always go there and load them and never again have to worry about losing them. And I tweak actions pretty frequently when I'm using them, so I try and remember to save them routinely, at least every week or two, so I don't lose too much of the changes I've made to those actions. So let's see, what comes next in our slides here? Okay, advantages of actions, and there are lots of them. They can be saved, we've covered most of these points. They can be saved for backup and for sharing, and they can be loaded. They can be edited, and I qualify that because in most cases, the only way to edit a given step in the action is to re-record it. You can't go in and edit the text that tells what that particular step is doing, but you can re-record it, and that's effectively having the same effect, but it's a little awkward comparing to editing a real program. They can be customized, and by that what I mean is you can each action basically each step in an action, is a single Photoshop command or adjustment. And there's a little box you can click that says, when I run this action, I actually want to bring up the user interface for that adjustment and tweak it on the fly. So you're not stuck with the specific parameters that you set with that adjustment when you first recorded that action. You can tweak them on the spot while you're running the action, which is very flexible sometimes. I've used that pretty frequently. Actions can also be invoked by other actions. So you can build, and I've done this, you can build actions that are nothing but a framework that calls other actions, and then you can turn those individual ones on and off before you run your collected action. And that again is very powerful and flexible because it gives you all sorts of power to control how, sequences of actions and how they're applied to a given image in a given circumstance. They can be applied to multiple images at once via the bridge image processor command. And most of this stuff is beyond the scope of this presentation today. I'm not going to be able to cover it all by any means, or we'll be here till midnight. But I'm not kidding. So I'm not going to try and cover all of these things, but remember that, keep the slide handy. Remember that they're possible, because as you get deeper and deeper into using actions, you'll want to start using these capabilities. They are very powerful. Okay, so how to run an action, and here's the description of it, and then I'm going to give a little demo of it. But first of all, you open the actions palette via the window menu in Photoshop. Then you click the menu icon in the upper right and choose Load Actions. And then you navigate to the folder where you have your saved action and select it. Once you've loaded it, then you click the Run button, the little right angle sort of triangle at the bottom, to actually run that action. And let's see, how did I? Let's see. Well, let's see. I'm gonna. I have images here open, so I'm going to go to one of my images to illustrate that. This is an image from our visit to Willow Lake a week or two ago. And this is just the basic image after raw conversion. I haven't made any adjustments whatsoever to it. But let's assume I want to run that aerochrome action that I sent around to everybody. Let me go ahead and show you how to do that. And for that, I'm going to have to get out of full screen mode because the zoom control bar here is covering up my menu in Photoshop. So I'm going to shrink this a little bit momentarily. This one, hang on. This one I use DxO to do the conversion, so I didn't have to apply a camera profile. But it would look similarly if I had. If I'd done it in Camera Raw, it wouldn't look much different. Yeah, in DxO, yeah. All right, so first of all, I would go to the window and choose the actions button here, and I actually already have the actions panel open, so all that does is switch to it. It didn't actually open a new version of it, and I'll move it over here so that you can see a little bit better. Now you'll notice I have a whole bunch of different collections of actions here. I have dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of actions that I've developed over the years, most of which I never use anymore. But I keep them handy just in case, because you never know when you might want to go back to one of them. And if nothing else, figure out how you did something 10 years ago. I can do that with these actions. But I'm going to go to the collection I sent around by email, which is the last one listed here, and I'm going to open up that collection. It's a folder basically, so you click that little drop down, and you get all the individual components of that folder. And let's see. I'm going to use the red-green channel swap as the demo action. So I select it. I go down here to the Run button. I click that, and poof, there you go. We've now done a red-green channel swap, and this is actually, I'm going to get the action palette out of the way here, and instead bring up the layers palette. This is actually an illustration of layers too, because what that action did was it created a new layer called the channel mixer layer. If I turn that layer off, then the effect of that action goes away. I click that little eyeball icon there to turn it off, and you can click again to turn it on. I'll illustrate one other thing about layers while we have this up here. You'll notice there's this slider called opacity here. And if I like what this layer does, but I think it's doing too much of it, simple. I just back off on opacity. And now you can see that layer is still having some effect, but not as much. You can the name of the slider is actually of that adjustment here is also a slider. If you put your cursor over it, you can move it back and forth, and it suddenly turns into a slider, so you can adjust it you know, to whatever degree you want and see the immediate effect of that. I normally don't do that with one of these channel swap layers, but there's no reason you can't, and you can do that with any layer you want. So that's one demonstration of what you can do with layers. I'll probably show you one or two other demos before we're done here today. But anyhow, that's how you run an action. That's just the illustration of how you run an action. So now let's go back to our slide. Where are we here? Here we go. All right, we were up to like slide 11. That's not the one. Here's the next slide in our presentation. And I can go back to full screen mode now. These are the 4 actions that I sent around a few days ago. The first one is IR diffusion, infrared diffusion. What that does basically is mimic the look you get with Kodak's old black and white infrared film, which had a tendency to cause diffuse appearance in highlights, especially in infrared images. And it's very useful with color images as well, color infrared images. And there's absolutely no reason you can't apply that to any other image. It doesn't have to be infrared. Sometimes that effect might be handy with other images too. The second one I call blue tone for infrared. And what all that does is add a separate layer that applies a little color toning to your image. And I call it blue tone for infrared, but no reason you can't use that one with other images too. It doesn't have to be infrared. Toning is very, very useful in black and white images. I do that a lot with black and white images. And for those of you who used to work with black and white images in the darkroom, you probably recall that you could buy some toner that you could wash your image in to apply a little bit of color tone. Well, that was one of them, yeah. But there were many others. But you could apply a little hint of color toning to your image, to your print, and it changed its character in very subtle ways. Typically, yeah.
Oh, it's easy.
Yeah, I agree. Blue is the other, that there are lots of other, I mean, any tone in the spectrum in principle you can apply to an image. So that's that blue tone for infrared images is included here because it's one that's invoked by the IR diffusion action. It creates a separate toning layer, and you can alter that toning layer. You can change the hue of the toning. It doesn't have to be blue. You can change its opacity. You can change its blend modes. There's a lot of things you can do with it to alter the effect it has on your image. But that's why it's here, is because it's used by the IR diffusion action. And then I just showed you the red-blue channel swap image or action, and that creates a separate layer. You can also do that in a form that doesn't create a separate layer, but there's no particular reason to do that. It's handy to have that separate layer because it's non-destructive and can be altered, you know, later on in your processing if you choose to. And then finally, the fourth one I provided is the aerochrome infrared image. And actually, I want to go back to our demo image for a moment. And let's go back to that one. And I'm going to get rid of this channel swap layer I just added by hitting the delete button, which didn't work. For some reason, sometimes it doesn't. There we go. All right. And then I'm going to go to the aerochrome infrared look action and demonstrate what it does. So I'll click the run button. Oh, and the first thing it does is give you a little alert that says you should have the top layer in your layer stack selected when you run this one. In this case, we only have one layer in the layer stack, the background layer. So that's immaterial in this case.
And that'll work even though that layer is locked.
Yeah, it doesn't alter that layer, so no problem. So I clicked continue on that little note that came up. Now I'm going to click the run button again, and presto. Now we have our aerochrome look layer. And there's just a little message here that tells you it has 4 adjustment layers, and it tells you go ahead and tweak any one of those to your heart's content and enjoy doing it. So I'm going to get out of that. And then let's pull up our layers palette over here again. I'm going to click the little drop down arrow here and show you the individual layers that are inside that aerochrome group. The first one is that channel swap layer, and it was created just exactly the same way as the demo I ran a few minutes ago to create a channel swap layer. I just renamed it in the action, but it's exactly the same kind of layer, has exactly the same adjustment in it. Then I have 3 other layers here that tweak the colors. Hue saturation does that. The selective color adjustment does that. It changes those reds from kind of a magenta to a more of a red tone. And then I have another selective color adjustment, which is a little more subtle, but it tweaks those reds a little bit further. And with the kind of images that I typically shoot, that's with my 550 nanometer filter, 550 on my full spectrum camera. Which one?
What's the last?
It's just a second selective color
Oh, it is.
layer.
Let's go back in.
Yeah, I made another tweak. And what I'll say about all of this is these 3 color adjustment layers that are included here are just a starting point. I almost always tweak them a bit before I decide I'm done with making these color adjustments. So as I say, they're just a starting point. That it's a really quick and easy way to create these layers, get them in position, and get some sort of default parameters added to them. But it's not necessarily what I want to finish the image with. And so what I'm going to do, I'll put the layers palette back down in this bunch here. And then I'm going to go to each of these layers in turn, the top 3 of them, and show you what they look like using the properties panel that lets you show the properties of and adjust the properties of those layers. And actually right now it's showing the properties of the mask on that layer, not the adjustments itself. So I'm going to click over here. I hope everybody can see the cursor there. Clicking on the actual content of that layer as opposed to its mask. And so now you see the properties, the adjustments basically that are applied by that layer. And this thing keeps getting in the way. That's Zoom doing that. Anyhow, these are the adjustment properties of that layer. So you'll see I've changed the hue by 20 points to the left. If I take that change away, there's what we started with. I don't like that as much because there's reddish tone in both the rocks and the tree here. And I want to have more separation between those tones. So I made that adjustment. Whoops, hang on. I'm going to go back to where we were. But that's only a starting point too, potentially. I can adjust that further and get all kinds of other looks to that layer. I think in this case, the default parameters are okay. One thing I'll point out about these adjustments in a hue saturation layer, though, if you're not already familiar with it, you have this drop down here that currently is labeled master. If you drop that one down, you'll notice it has adjustments for each of 6 or 7, what is it, 7 different color or 6 different color ranges besides the master. You have reds, yellows, greens, cyans, blues, and magentas. And I don't recall. So well, first of all, let me show you what happens. If I choose reds here, for example, now you'll notice I have a new set of sliders here that are all set at their default 0 positions. But now I can adjust just the reds if I want to. And you'll notice it doesn't change the look of the sky or the rocks. All I'm doing now is changing those red tones, altering their hue, turning them orange or green or purple or whatever. And you can do that with each of the 6 different color ranges that it lists here. And I don't think I've done that with any of those color ranges by default in this action. So no, they're all still set at their default values, but that lets you put some pretty selective color adjustments in particular parts of your image if you want to. And just to complete that picture, I'm going to do one other thing here. Let's suppose you wanted to adjust the color of the rocks in this particular picture. So those are somewhere in either the blue or magenta range to my eye. I'm going to call them blue here. So I'll pick the blue selection there in that drop down. But then I'm going to do one other thing. I'm going to make this adjustment actually match the blues in the image. And the way you do that is to click this eyedropper icon right here. And you'll notice your cursor now changes into an eyedropper. And then I'm going to click on that blue area, bluish area. It's actually sort of purple, but I'm going to call it blue. But I'm going to click on that rock here, which has that blue hint to it. And watch what happens right over here when I do that. I click, and look what it did. It shifted these little slider thingies over here, actually more into the magenta range. Those rocks are actually more magenta than blue. So now and you notice it even changed the label to blue up here because it said, hey, wait a minute, you got that one wrong. Those are magenta. But it probably hasn't picked the default magenta range. It's picked a magenta range that corresponds to the color of those rocks. And I have more control over it than that. This little central area of these sliders here represents the region where this adjustment has the full effect. And then the regions on either side of that, between those 2 central boundaries and the edge, are where that adjustment is feathered away. So you can see that the adjustment extends into the blue range of our spectrum here, but it's feathered away as it gets farther and farther into that range, and I can control that. If I want to have more of the blues, I just slide that over there. If I want the full effect to be applied farther into the blue range, I can slide that little marker over there. And I can do the same thing on the right-hand side and move the effect farther into the red range if I want to. I can change the amount of the width of that feathered area. The reason you want to feather the edges of this adjustment are because otherwise you might get banding. You might see the adjustment might be so abrupt that it starts looking like banding. So it's a good idea to leave some of that feathering in place. Anyhow, bottom line is you can change that range that you adjust to whatever degree you want to, and then you can start adjusting the hue or the saturation. And so now I'm adjusting the blues and magentas in this image without affecting, well, actually we've overlapped into the reds enough that I'm affecting the tree too in this case. But normally you would set these markers here such that you excluded that adjustment from the reds. Let's see if we can trick it into doing that by moving those. And now you can see it's adjusting mostly just the sky and the rocks and not affecting the reds, not affecting the tree. So that's a very powerful characteristic of this hue saturation layer. And I'm not going to talk too much more about it because we'll run out of time if I do. But that's one of the powerful things about this hue saturation layer. Okay, so enough about the hue saturation layer. I'm not going to tweak it further. Selective color adjustment it has a drop down that lets you choose different colors: reds, greens, yellows, blues, magentas, cyans. In addition, whites, neutrals, and blacks, whites, grays, and blacks, basically. I'm not going to touch it here, but actually I do need to show you what I did with this one. I haven't altered the reds. You can see these values are the same. I probably altered the magentas here. Yeah, you can see these values all here are different from the default values, which are 0. And that's because I've used this adjustment to alter the magentas in the image. If I take away that layer, you can see the magentas are all altered by that particular adjustment. And I don't know if I've adjusted anything else here or not, but let's take a quick look. I think the answer is no. Yeah. Yeah, the others are all set at their default values. So it's only magentas that I've adjusted with this particular layer. But that's the result. And you can tweak those adjustments as much as you want. What these individual colors do, this adjustment works in the CMYK color space. And so it adjusts cyans, magentas, yellows, and blacks. And what the sliders do is they add or subtract those individual colors. So what I've done with this one is I've subtracted some cyan, which makes the image more warm. Basically, it sort of shifts colors towards the orange end of the spectrum, basically, or orange part of the spectrum. I have adjusted magentas to boost their appearance by adding 30 points to or 30% to that slider. Adjusted yellow by even more, 40%. And if I took that away, you can see it looks much more magenta or purplish with that adjustment taken away. I'll put it back. And then black, I've added black to it. I've added 10% black to it. And that just darkens the colors that are affected by this particular adjustment. If I take that away, you'll see they get a little lighter. And if I take more black away, you'll see they get lighter still. You do that to some degree, yeah. Well, yeah, that you lose at least the appearance of detail. Yeah, in the display. I almost never use them, and that's why. Yeah, yeah. Mostly, I just use this. I just use this adjustment to adjust colors, not the tonality. But yeah, you can use white and neutral in them as well. I typically don't. Okay, so that's what this color adjustment layer does. The other one has more subtle adjustments to it, and it's just in the red. And you can barely see that adjustment. I put that in there for some specific reason. I don't even remember why now, but with this particular image, I'd actually like to have these leaves in the tree, the foliage, look more red than it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add even more yellow, because right now it has kind of a magenta hue to it. And I can probably, well, that's having less effect than I thought it would, but I'll add more yellow, and then I'm going to take away magenta by reducing that. And that's not having much effect either. Well, I think the reason is because I've chosen relative rather than absolute. That moderates the effect of these adjustments. So let's see here. With absolute selected, you can see a little bit more of a effect. We take away magenta. It has some effect, but mostly it just desaturates it. Let's try removing some cyan from it. That's having a bit more of an effect. Anyhow, that's the kind of adjustment I would do. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but that's the kind of adjustments I would do with these layers. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to put the properties panel back where it belongs here, or where I usually keep it. And I'm actually going to go into the history long enough to undo that last adjustment. And we'll move on to our next slide. But that's anyhow, that's what that aerochrome action does. And that's a good illustration of how you can then tweak layers that you've created after you have added them to your layer stack. So now let's go back and find the slide we came from. It's not this one. Let's go back 2 or 3 more. There we go. Okay. That's not the one we came from. Yes, it is actually. Okay. So that's an illustration of actions and layers, more lengthy than I intended, I guess, but it covered a lot of very useful things, I think. So these are the 4 actions that I sent around. I encourage you to give them a try, and I do encourage you to convert your images to 8 bits so you can try the IR diffusion one. It's very unlikely you'll be disappointed. But let's move on. Any questions about actions or layers before we move on? I think we've covered some already, but okay, not hearing any more. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about the overall shape of the workflow and what you're trying to achieve when you do a workflow apply a workflow to an infrared image. And actually, there's nothing special about infrared images as far as this particular point is concerned. And you notice I've asked a couple questions on this slide, but I haven't put any answers down. And that's because I'm interested in hearing your answers. So what are we trying? What are the objectives of a post-processing workflow? What are we trying to achieve when we take an image that we've just converted from a raw file and apply further adjustments to it? Don't all speak at once.
For me, Jim, it's trying.
Hang on, Mary Lisa's speaking here. Mary Lisa, I didn't quite hear what you said. Could you repeat it?
Sorry. For me, post-processing is trying to convey the vision I had of this place or the mood of the subject that I'm, working with. So it's a lot about my own emotional reaction to what I was seeing.
Very good. Yes. And I'm not sure if everybody could hear that. Your volume isn't very, very loud and on the speakers on my laptop here. But what she basically said, her objective for post-processing is to try and achieve the vision, the intent that she had for that image when she set out to make that image. Did I capture that adequately, Mary Lisa?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great, good. That's an excellent answer. Anybody else?
That's pretty much what I was going to say.
Okay.
To other people, what you saw, when you saw it, and you recorded that in the camera. The camera doesn't see what you see.
Yes, that's true. The camera doesn't see what you see, and certainly if your objective is to convey pretty explicitly and literally what you saw when you're making the image, then that's a perfectly valid objective. In the case of an infrared image, it's a little less applicable because you're not, with an infrared image, you're not trying to show what your eye saw. You're trying definitely to show something that your eye didn't see. So there's a variant or a wrinkle on that objective in that particular case. But yes, in general, and whether you saw it with your eye, you may have seen it in your mind and be trying to achieve what you saw there. And that, of course, is pretty much what Mary Lisa said as well. Any other ideas?
Well, you're trying to accelerate the creativity that infrared gives you the possibility of achieving.
Hear, hear.
Because it has a wider range of possibilities than what you just get in having a very good photograph, which shows you what you see. It sees a lot more than we see. So I'm trying to extrapolate and take advantage of the things that the infrared sees that I don't see.
Yep, very good. Mary Lisa, did you hear that well enough?
Sorry, I forget to unmute. Yes, I did hear it.
Okay, good. I was trying to hold the microphone toward Sherry when she was speaking.
Yeah, thank you. I
Well, it sounds like
appreciate
it worked. But that's an excellent answer, of course. With infrared, you're definitely trying to show more than your eye can see. Something that's different from what your eye can see. That's, I mean, just by definition, what you're doing when you're shooting infrared. John, you had a comment you wanted to make, or?
Well, I agree. Wholeheartedly with what you said, but there's another opportunity, and that is what you felt when you were taking the picture.
Aha.
What was it like in the environment in which you were working, and what you wanted to do with that?
Yes, yep, excellent. Again, I'll just elaborate on what John said a little bit. What you felt was not just an explicit response to what your eyes saw. It was sort of an imaginary response. It was a response to an imaginary image in your head to some degree, because you're imagining what this image might turn out like after you process the infrared image, which you can't really see with your eye, and you get a very poor approximation of that on the back of your camera normally too. So you have to imagine what its potential is and kind of work on that basis rather than looking at just what's before your eyes. Great, those are all wonderful answers, and I'll show you my answers in a minute, and they're not much different from all of these actually. So then, in addition to the above, what are the particular objectives of an infrared post-processing workflow? And we've covered a fair amount of that answer already, I think. Does anybody have anything they want to add?
You have to expand. Sorry about that. You have to expand white balance in particular in order to be able to take advantage of an infrared photograph, because you're limited with just what the normal DSL will allow you. You need to get that expansion to be able to take advantage of all of the potential that you would get. So that gives you more lights and lighting and darks and detail that you wouldn't get if you were limited just to what the DSLR would normally see.
Yep, and again, Mary Lisa, did you hear that okay?
Yes, I did. Sorry, I have you on mute, so it takes me a while to unmute, but
It's
yeah,
okay, no problem.
I have me on mute, I mean.
Yeah, no problem. Anyhow, I very much agree with that. Processing infrared images is pretty fundamentally different from processing visible light images. And the basic reason is because nobody expects an infrared image to look like what your eye will see. It gives you all kinds of freedoms and a bewildering array of choices potentially, but that's the fact. So let me move on to the slide that has my answers to this, and I don't think you'll find any of these to be too different from what you've already said. Actually, the first bullet here may be a little different from what anybody has specifically said, but one of your objectives when you're post-processing images is technical excellence. You want the exposure to be good. You want the colors to be in range. You don't want highlights to be blown out. You want a nice sharp focus most of the time, unless you're using a lens, baby. So you want technical excellence and all that entails. But then my way of summarizing what everybody else has already said pretty much is you want a satisfying result. And that satisfying result is recognized in terms of what story does your image tell? Is it aesthetically pleasing? Other words like that you can apply that kind of define how you and your audience respond to the image. You're ultimately trying to create an image that gets a response in people, you and people, other people probably. So, and of course, the defining what that is and identifying what it is, that's a very arbitrary process, but that's part of the equation here. Now, my answer to the second question is that all of the things we talked about for any old image still apply for infrared images, really. But then we want this other thing called separation. And that's actually what Sherry was talking about, even though she used different terms. But separation is what we're looking for here, because that significantly affects and facilitates the further processing of your infrared image. So what the heck is separation anyway? I don't remember where it was, some article I read in some photography magazine many years ago that first introduced the term separation to me in the context of photography. And what it really means is just the ability to differentiate between neighboring tones or neighboring objects in an image. And the problem with photographs is that they're two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional scenes and subjects. And with three-dimensional scenes and subjects, especially if both of your eyes work, you have binocular vision, so you can instantly differentiate between, like I'm looking at the rim around my computer screen right now, and Sherry's screen or John's screen is right behind it. They're almost identical in color. And yet I can easily distinguish between the two because my eyes tell me that this one is closer than that one because I have binocular vision. But when you have a photograph, a two-dimensional picture in front of you, you don't have that 3D info available to you when you look at that picture. And those two tones that are almost identical can confuse your eye. You have a hard time distinguishing that this is a different object from that one, or you have a difficult time distinguishing that this one is in front of that one rather than being next to it. So what do you do about that? Well, in photography, what you do is you try and achieve separation. And separation usually means separating those tones on the tonal scale enough so that you can recognize that they represent different objects, or separating the colors on your color spectrum enough so that you can recognize that they're different objects. And there are other techniques that sometimes are used too. For example, you use selective focus. You know, if this one's in focus and that one's out of focus, I right away know that one of them is a different distance than the other. So that's what we mean by separation. And when you're processing infrared images, it's even more important because one of the major things you're going to be doing, one of the chief techniques you use in processing infrared images is treating different colors differently. And that's true whether you're doing black and white or color infrared images. Either way, a lot of the adjustments you're going to make are going to be so that you can separate those different colors in the original image from each other to make them stand out from each other in the final result. So, does that all make sense to everybody? Okay, good. Let's move on then.
Helps you out on that. Because the infrared actually sees into things like tattoos.
Oh.
And, you know, it penetrates where a normal camera, a visible light camera, you have an effective way of saying the difference. I like that term. Visible light doesn't go through, like a tattoo is flat, but not an infrared. Infrared, it will penetrate the skin and you will see a difference in how it sets on the skin.
Yeah.
And that's the difference with infrared that's so fascinating.
Yep, that's.
Or trees or.
Yep. No quarrel for me on that.
As you do it on a regular basis.
Thank you kindly. That's kind of you. So, with that idea under our belt now, let's move on here I'm going to talk about what I call the architecture of your infrared post-processing scheme of things. And architect, I'm probably misusing the term architecture here, but it's the basic framework. The basic framework of your yeah, but the basic, this is how I conceive of the basic framework, the architecture of an infrared workflow. You start with raw conversion, of course. We've talked about that last time, and I'm not really going to try and elaborate on that this time. But during raw conversion, you make color adjustments and tonal adjustments, exposure adjustments, etc. You might do sharpening and noise reduction, or you might save those for your post-processing steps, depending on which tools you use, etc. You probably do spot removal if you have spots on your sensor, which most of us do by the time we've used our cameras a few times. You probably want to do that during raw conversion. You might want to do lens corrections, especially, and I'll qualify that a little bit. Lens corrections, you can do those during raw conversion, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Hot spots, those can be corrected during raw conversion of infrared images. You can correct flare during raw conversion as well. You may or may not want to. It's your choice. You can also do that in post-processing. And there are times where you want to leave those hot spots or those flares in too. People use those for artistic purposes sometimes. So you don't necessarily want to do that. Let me come back to lens corrections for just a moment. Raw converters usually have two kinds of lens correction. They have chromatic aberration and, well, actually they have more than two. Chromatic aberration and distortion are the ones, though, that you typically apply in most cases. And I always do chromatic aberration because the raw converters do that better than any post-processing technique I've ever tried. So normally you're going to want to do chromatic aberration corrections during raw processing.
I apologize.
The distortion correction, you may or may not want to do that at all. Normally, if you do want to do it, you want to do it in raw processing, but there are exceptions to that potentially too. But I find sometimes I kind of like that distortion. And so I leave it in place. I'll try it both ways while I'm doing the raw conversion and decide how much of it I want. And you can also, there's a slider too, so you can dial back that distortion without getting rid of it all. And in fact, in camera raw, at least, you can exaggerate it as well. That slider goes both directions. You can apply more distortion than what is natively present in your lens if you want to. And I do that occasionally. And then let's see, what's the other, vignetting is the other correction that you often apply during raw conversion. And I usually do that as well in raw conversion, but not necessarily all the time. Photos usually look better in my experience and my practice if they're darker around the edges than they are in the middle, because that kind of draws your attention into the middle. So you may not want to do vignetting correction in raw conversion. Anyhow, those are all the choices you're faced with in raw conversion, and a bunch of others too, for example, that I'm not going to elaborate on. But those are the ones you might be likely to do during raw conversion. Now, the next step or next stage is the basic adjustments of your converted image. And you notice these are all listed as basically optional. I say you might possibly want to do any one of these things, but you don't necessarily do them. First of all, some of them you may have already done in raw conversion, in which case you don't need to do them again. Channel swaps, you don't necessarily want to do those with all images, but they're certainly optional if you want to do them. And lots of other color adjustments you can apply too, and also black and white conversions. You can actually apply black and white conversions during raw processing as well. I almost never do that because once you've done it, it's not alterable. And so it's better to save that for your post-processing rather than your raw conversion, in case you want to come back and tweak it afterwards. But you can do it during raw conversion. So anyhow, that's to my way of looking at things anyhow, that's your stage two, your basic adjustments that you probably want to make with all images or most images, whether or not you do them during raw conversion or your first stage of post-processing. Next slide. We'll call the next set stage two adjustments. And these are, again, some of them are optional. Pretty much all of them are optional, actually. The IR diffusion effect, some color processing, and I'll show you a demo of what I mean by the second bullet here. But with a lot of images, even if I'm ultimately planning on turning an image into a color image, I often convert it to black and white anyway, somewhere during the post-processing. Because that's a great way of controlling the tones of individual colors in that image. And I'll demonstrate how I do that. Very powerful. Not an original technique that I invented. I read about it somewhere and tried it and discovered it works really well. But then once you've converted an image to black and white, then you may want to add back a little bit of color, and I often do that with my images. So anyhow, that's that second step there, second bullet is optional, but I do it frequently. More tonal and color adjustments, and you can use third-party tools for that if you want, or use Photoshop's built-in capabilities. And as I say in the last bullet there, let your imagination flow, because anything you might want to consider is fair game. In fact, I encourage you to try stuff that you think is totally crazy, because you might be surprised at what you come up with and might be pleased with what you come up with. And then the final stage here that I call finishing touches. As I mentioned earlier, I darken the edges of almost every image I make. I apply some special effects sometimes and often use third-party tools to do that. I'll give you one or two examples a little later if we have time. I add a signature or a wall mark, and I always add a caption and a title and things like that, and a copyright notice in the metadata, and I'll show you how I do that as well. So those are the 4 stages of post-processing that I think about, and I usually do things in this order, more or less, when I do post-processing too. And I apologize for using the word architecture. Okay, so going back to my set of slides from our second session, I put down a list of best practices for capturing infrared images, and it occurred to me maybe I should have a list of best practices for post-processing as well. But this is the only one I could think of, and you'll notice it looks pretty familiar because it was the same one I put in the capturing images part of this workshop. Use the histogram. I keep an eye on the histogram throughout my post-processing work. You can see it right here on screen as we speak. And I always keep it positioned there. Occasionally I look at other panels in this collection, but I always come back to the histogram, and I always look at the histogram before I decide an image is finished, just to make sure it looks balanced. It looks like it's giving me what I think will look good, whether I display the image digitally or whether I print it. And that those two aren't necessarily quite the same either, but in any case, it needs to be roughly the same and, quote, balanced, or whatever that means, before I'll believe I'm satisfied with it. But as I say, as the bullets say here, adjustments you make can easily cause, especially color adjustments, those can easily cause one of your color channels to get pretty seriously clipped. And you want to keep an eye out for that. That isn't even necessarily bad, but you want to pay attention to it. It's usually the red channel, in my experience, that gets clipped first. And when it does, you start losing detail in the red parts of your image. And you have to use your own judgment as to whether you miss that detail or not. Sometimes it's not really noticeable, but you want to pay attention to it in any case. So I check the histogram frequently while I'm in the midst of my post-processing. So any questions or discussion about all of that? Hearing none, let's move on. And that kind of completes the slides I've prepared for this. Now I'm going to do demonstrations. And I have several images that Mark and Tim have brought to work with. I'm going to start with one of my own, and not going to spend too much time on it because I want to save time to look at the others. But this is the one we've already looked at, where I applied the aerochrome look to it and used it as a demo. It's from our trip to Willow Lake a week or two ago. And I chose this one because it had this nice tree with lots of color in it that was framed nicely by these rocks and a few other ancillary.
They're really nice. Hadn't quite noticed that in some of the other photographs, but that really shows that off.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And the other nice thing about it from my perspective is it shows the rugged environment these trees are living in. They're growing out of cracks in those rocks. They find a little bit of soil embedded in those cracks, and that's what they take root in. It's pretty remarkable, actually. It's like a bonsai environment for those trees. So as I say, here's what the image looks like straight out of the raw converter. And I've adjusted the colors in the raw converter a bit to get lots of separation between the blue foliage and the reddish or magenta rocks here. And then the aerochrome adjustment gives you further tweaks on that. And what I very frequently do.
Explain the raw converter just a touch more. What is a raw converter?
Oh, it's either Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom.
Okay.
Or in my case, in this image, I use DxO Photo Lab, which I actually tend to prefer nowadays to the Adobe tools.
So I just wanted to know what the definition.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no problem. Thank you for clarifying that. Anyhow, let's see, I sort of lost my track here. But one thing I often do, I think this is where I was, what I often do as a first step is run a black and white conversion. And I will either use Silver Effects Pro or the built-in black and white converter in Photoshop, normally Photoshop, but sometimes I try Silver Effects Pro as well, because it can give you some different results and also has a lot more tools at your disposal to get some effects that you can't get with the Photoshop converter. So let's go ahead and add a black and white layer here, wherever it is. There it is. Okay, so here's a black and white version of that image, and to my eye it looks pretty ugly as it stands, but that's because we haven't made any tweaks to the black and white adjustment yet. If most of you have probably used this black and white tool in Photoshop previously, but in case you haven't, or in case you don't have much experience with it, it has separate adjustments for each of 6 colors. They're all primary colors in different color spaces: red, green, and blue, or cyan, magenta, or green, actually RGB, red, yellow, and green, or cyan, blue, and magenta in the 2 different color spaces. And what those sliders do is they control the brightness of those colors from the original color image in your converted black and white image. And just to demonstrate what I mean by that, I happen to know that these trees are pretty blue in the original image. So let's look at what happens if I slide the blue slider here. And the sky is blue too, actually, so it's affecting the sky a lot as well. But look what it does to those trees. Actually, it's not doing as much as I expected it to. That's because the trees must be more magenta. There we go. Yeah, trees are more magenta. So yes, if I tweak the magenta slider, it does remarkable things to those trees. It can change them from black to white and anywhere in between, basically. So that's what the effect of these sliders is. Now, I happen to know that the rocks, meanwhile, are more of a purplish color. Let's see what happens. Yeah, if I lower the blue slider here, it darkens both the rocks and the sky, makes those trees really stand out. You can overdo that, of course, but somewhere in there, you're going to find a setting that gives you a lot of separation between those trees and those rocks and alters their tones selectively to a great degree. Cyan might have some effect here too, a much more subtle effect, because you don't see it in the rocks. You see a little bit of it in the sky, mostly in the later parts of the sky. And then reds will probably also have some effect on the trees. Yeah. In fact, I'm gonna back off on the magenta and use red instead here. Well, we need a combination to get the real effect here. But you can see the reds affect the trees as well, somewhat differently from the magentas. But anyhow, somewhere in there, you're probably going to find a setting that you like, and a setting that actually makes for a pretty good black and white image. So you're welcome to stop there if you want. You might be perfectly happy with that, or you're welcome to move on. But in any case, you've achieved control over the tonal values of the different colors in that image just with this one setting. And that's pretty powerful in its own right. So I'm going to leave the settings as I've shown them here. I'm going to put this panel back where I had it parked normally. And then I'm going to show you something else. And what I'm going to show you is right now we have a layer that turns this image into a black and white image, but we may want to have a little color left. And here's one way of putting some color back into that image. I'm going to move the opacity slider for that layer. And now we're backing off on that black and white adjustment. Now we have kind of pink trees. Looks like cherry trees in Washington or Tokyo or somewhere. But you don't see too much effect on anything else. The colors in the sky and the rocks are relatively subtle here, so we're not seeing much effect of this adjustment. So that's one way of adding a little bit of color to your image. The problem with doing it this way is you're also changing the tonal adjustments represented by that black and white layer. You're backing off on those as well. That may be good, that may be bad. It depends on the image and it depends on your taste, but bear in mind that that's what you're doing. But that's one way of adding more color back to this image. I'll show you another way of doing that. This drop down right here, which is currently labeled normal, is the blend mode for that layer. If I click it, you'll notice we have a lot of choices here. You can try any one of those, and Photoshop is even kind enough to give you a preview of what each one of them looks like. And each one of these has a very detailed description in the in Photoshop's user guide, so it tells you exactly what it's doing. I'm not going to try and cover that now, but experiment with them, and you might find one you really like. And I'll show you the one that I often use. Not hue. Hue, there's no hue to a black and white image, so the hue, adjusting the hue doesn't affect it, but color does. Except it's failing to give me the preview. Oh, sorry. No, wrong. I misspoke there. It's not color, it's luminosity. Luminosity is brightness and darkness of different regions of an image. So it applies the luminosity of that black and white conversion without altering the colors of the original. And so it changes the luminosity to match that black and white image that we were looking at just a moment ago. And again, this is pretty extreme. It's actually blown out some of the foliage and stuff, and the colors might look a little garish, but we can, that's true too, yes. But we can back off on the opacity of that layer. and apply as much or as little of that luminosity effect as we want. If we set the opacity, what are we at? 48%, there's what it looks like. So we've lightened the foliage, haven't affected the sky or the rocks too much in this case. But we can, as I say, we can keep that opacity any way we want. So that's another way of adding color back into your black and white or image, and controlling the colors and the tonal values independently of each other potentially. There's another way of doing it too, though, and I'll show you that as well, since we're already talking about that. And this is the way I more often than not do it. I will go to the background layer, the original layer. I will right click it to give this menu, and then I will choose duplicate layer. And it's just going to be called, I'm going to change the name of that duplicate layer. I'm going to call it add back color, which is what I usually call these layers, and click OK. So now I have a second layer identical to the background layer, except for its name, and it has no effect on the image when I take it away because it's identical to the one just underneath it. But watch what happens if I change the blend mode to color and then move it up to the top of the layer stack. Now it's affecting only the color, not the tonality of that image. So I've taken that black and white image with its tonal adjustments and added the original colors back to it. And again, this looks kind of strange and garish to me, but it's still very useful if you back off its opacity and add it gradually back in. Here we're at 50%, 60% opacity. And now we're adding some relatively subtle color back into that original image. And you can see how different it looks if I take that away.
So Jim, can I ask a question?
Certainly.
Because I haven't seen this done before. So you've taken your background layer, you've copied that. So I'm not exactly seeing what's the top. And you put it at the top. And you're now setting that blend mode to color.
Yeah.
And then now you're fooling about with the opacity.
Correct.
Okay, right, got it.
Fooling about, good term. Nice technical term. Yes. And yes, there's lots of fooling about involved in this stuff, and I encourage it wholeheartedly.
Jim, sorry.
Go ahead, Mary Lisa.
So you duplicated your background layer though without the color adjustment layers you had previously done, such as your aerochrome group.
Not true. Those are still in there. They actually do have an effect because those were present when I did the black and white conversion.
Oh, okay.
Those are underneath the black and white layer. So the black and white adjustments were actually applied on the colors that were present after that aerochrome adjustment.
I see. So you used it.
I can illustrate. I'll show you what that does. I'm going to turn off the add back color layer, and then I'll turn off that aerochrome group. And you can see now the black and white image looks totally different because those black and white adjustments are being applied to a totally different color scheme, the original color scheme for that image, rather than those that were adjusted with that aerochrome group. So, to my eye, this add back color operation isn't really very satisfying, no matter how much or how little of it I apply. I'm not totally happy with it. And the real reason for that is because it's not totally compatible with the tonal adjustments made in the black and white layer. The trees are just too bright, and that brightness tends to wash out the colors that are applied on top of them now by that add back color layer. But that's easy to change because, as I told you earlier, these adjustments are all non-destructive. So I can go back to that black and white layer. And again, I'll move it over here so we can see all the sliders. I can go back to that layer and redo those adjustments. Now, the trees are in the after the aerochrome adjustment they tend to be kind of reddish. So I'm going to drop down the brightness of that red slider a bit. Maybe we'll tweak magenta a bit too. Yeah, there we're getting some differences there now that I think are pretty useful. We can back off on how bright those trees are by adjusting this black and white layer. And we can get them, and I could spend all afternoon playing with these adjustments. I'm not going to do that, but we can get them, we can probably get those to some range, some point where we're more satisfied with what those trees look like after we add back in some of their color. So that's why it's so powerful to have non-destructive editing using layers. So now I'm going to put this properties panel back. And then I'm going to show one other thing real quickly before we move on to another image. I think we've pretty much. I probably have. Yeah, I most likely have. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Go back and try to add some color.
Yeah, there's no reason you can't. The black and white conversions, whether you do it in Photoshop or in Nik, they don't actually alter individual pixels in your original image. They don't alter the actual content of those pixels. They may alter the tonality and the color of them, of course, but they leave the pixels themselves in place. So yeah, after the Nik black and white conversion, this add back color should still work just fine. And as I say, I've done it. I've never noticed any issues with it. So yeah, by all means, give it a try. Okay, the one other thing I will illustrate real quick about with this add back color layer. Right now, its opacity is at 40%, and I'm not going to agonize too much about setting it somewhere else. But I am going to show you what different blend modes look like when we do it this way, after we've done it this way. And in particular, there are a couple that I use frequently, overlay and soft light, and actually sometimes hard light too, and vivid light. You can see each of those gives you a different look. And the nature of that different look is it effectively alters the local contrast by changing the function whereby these two layers are blended with each other. It's a mathematical operation, actually. But you can see it has some pretty interesting effects in terms of how dramatic the image looks and also how the colors look. So overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid light, linear light, sometimes pin light, those give you all. Oh, which one? Sorry. Yeah. So you can do those, but you can get some really weird results too. Hard mix and difference, exclusion, etc. Those are useful in other contexts, but not here so much. But then once you've done that, I'll just arbitrarily pick one, say vivid light here. Then you can go back and tweak the opacity further and decide where you like it the best. Okay, so there's opacity of 0. That's the original black and white image. And add back a little bit of that color with the vivid light blend mode. And you notice it's really making those clouds look more dramatic as we do this. And it enhances it enhances the foliage, but it also darkens the rocks and brings out the patterns in them more when you do that.
And then if you wanted to, you could always create a mask on the rock, so you could take that magenta out of the rock.
This is all true too, absolutely. So these are just a handful of the truly infinite range of choices and options you have when you're processing infrared images. But this, actually, I find this sort of appealing. It's a nice dramatic looking tree and dramatic looking clouds behind it.
It'll wash out in the
Yeah, it has, but there are ways you can control that too. So anywho, that's the kind of stuff you can do with these images. I'm actually going to save this because I like this. I like what we've done with it. And you'll notice I always save my images as TIFF files, but you notice by default, it's saving it with no compression here. I'm going to choose zip compression instead because that's the maximum non-destructive or non-lossy compression you can apply to these images. You get smaller files that way. It also takes longer to process them, but that doesn't bother me. So, and I use PCs, so I'm choosing the PC byte order. I don't think that actually matters. Photoshop can read them either way. But in any case, I compress the image using the zip compression method and also the layers using the zip compression method, and then click OK, so it will save it. And now I'm going to go on to one of Mark's images. I already have his thumb drive plugged in. Let's spend a little time looking at his image. And he's provided a raw file here for the one I was thinking of looking at. So Mary, you're not going to see the raw conversion of this one, but it's not going to take long. And I don't think there's anything very instructive about the raw conversion I'm going to do anyway, because it's going to be a very quick and dirty basic raw conversion. I almost always use DxO Photolab to do raw conversions these days. So that's what I'm going to use here. And Mary, forgive me because you won't see this because it's not the screen I'm sharing, but
I'm seeing it, Jim.
Sorry?
I see it.
Oh, you do see it? Oh, okay. Well, good. I didn't think you would, but I'm glad you do. So, oh, I have to, it needs a Z6 camera body module, but that won't take long to download. In fact, it's done. Okay, so I know I have some filters applied, so I'm going to take those away so they'll actually see the images. Here we go. There are the images on Mark's thumb drive, and we were going to do not that one. I think this one is the one we'll do. This is that heron that was at Willow Lake a week or two ago. And as I say, I'm just going to do some real quick adjustments here. This won't take long at all because these are easy adjustments to do, and I love what this raw converter does with them. I'm not going to touch the colors, I don't think, because we already have a pretty good range of colors here. What filter is on your camera, Mark? 590, okay, yeah, working quite well. This is noise reduction, and I'll do this, well, actually, no, I'm not going to do the highest noise reduction. I always do chromatic aberration correction on these, except it's not, there we go. Why isn't it doing that?
The lens maybe, so.
Oh.
Has no information.
Oh, yes, you're right. So, all right, well, we're not going to do lens corrections then. So we're done. That's all the adjustments we need to do to.
That's what it was.
Yeah, actually, it's a little on the dark side, not to quote Star Wars or anything, but
Yeah.
I'm going to brighten it up a little bit here. Yes. Well, if you're becoming infrared converters, you better, or infrared photographers, you better get used to the dark side. All right. All right. I think that's close enough. I'm looking at the histogram like I always do. And I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and export that to the disk. And Mark, I'll just put this one on your thumb drive. I just have to find it here. And I guess you don't have
I don't have
a folder. Okay. All right. And I always add a suffix of DxO to the file name, so you know which raw converter I used. And presto, it's busy getting converted. It'll take, with this laptop, this is a very fast laptop, which I just bought for this purpose. It won't take more than a few seconds to do this conversion. it's done. Okay, so I'm gonna get out of this now. And go back to Photoshop, or back to Bridge actually. And there's your converted image. We'll open that. And here we go. Expand your window. Expand it some more. So you can see the whole thing. Come on. Okay. So what we have here is trees that have a bluish cast, as they usually do in infrared. There's a dust spot on your sensor, which I haven't tried to correct, but you'll want to do that at some point. Yeah. In any case, here's the basic image. And I like it, first of all. I like it a lot of these. These clouds are really nice and dramatic, and that's partly the raw converter that made them look that way. The adjustments I made there. But it's a nice composition. It's a nice picture, nice scene, nice composition. So let's try what I said I often do first, which is the black and white conversion. And there are lots of defaults presets here, and I often just run through those to give myself a quick idea of what the starting point might be. You can see how much difference those make. And again, that's because each one of those presets tweaks those color sliders differently. And you can see the result of that. This is one I kind of like as a starting point. But I'm sorry?
There's some glow showing up now too.
Oh, in the foliage, yeah, that's right. And we know those are blue, so if I tweak the blue and cyan sliders, or maybe the magenta slider. Magenta often in these images serves as an overall brightness adjustment to some degree, because the colors in your infrared image generally tend to be more blue or magenta. And there's usually almost no green or yellow in a converted infrared image. Cyan's not having much effect. I can tell you that green's not likely to have any effect at all. Yeah, red will, I'm pretty sure.
So you're not gonna do a channel swap yet?
No, you can do that in a different order because it's done as non-destructive and on a separate layer. Notice how dramatic that looks if we bring down the reds though.
Your glows.
Yes, the foliage glow is showing. And if we bring up the blues or magentas some more, it'll show even more. Okay, so I kind of like that. I'm going to leave it pretty much like that because I love how dramatic that looks. And back to that idea of separation. One thing I like this is because of the separation you get between the sky and the trees.
Yeah.
And it also makes the bird stand out nicely. So I'm going to leave it like that as our black and white adjustment. And then I'm going to turn that one off. And to Sherry's suggestion a moment ago, let's go ahead and try well, yeah, oh, it has, okay, well, it does everything that Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom do when converting a raw file, but it has some additional capabilities as well. And I really like it because those additional capabilities are pretty valuable and save me a lot of time that I might otherwise have to spend in post-processing. So yeah, I usually do that. But yes, it has a full range of color adjustments, just like Camera Raw does. Anywho, let's see what happens if we do a channel swap on this. And I'm going to do it via that aerochrome action so that we have not only the channel swap, but those other adjustments built in as well. So here we go. Again, it's giving us that little warning, and I'm gonna put more of that and do this. Okay, so there's the aerochrome look. It doesn't look much like aerochrome actually, because the foliage is usually very red in aerochrome images. But it doesn't look bad either. It's not, this is a good place to start with if you want.
Blue to the water and more blue to the sky.
Yeah, yeah, the water's reflecting that blue in the sky, basically, but you're right. So I'm gonna temporarily turn off these other three color adjustment layers and show you just what the channel swap layer looks like. And you can see swapping channels makes a difference, as you'd expect. And that's what you get when you do the channel swap. And then if I turn on hue saturation here, we see some further shifts in the colors. Not sure I like them, but we leave them on there for now. Turn on this first selective color. That doesn't make much difference, and that's because it's adjusting the reds. And there really aren't any obvious reds in this picture. The yellowish color of the trees overlaps red enough that you see a little bit of effect of this selective color adjustment, but it's pretty subtle. And then this one probably won't make any difference at all, really.
Yes, this is a good question.
Certainly.
Is the color balance,
On the cool side in this photo, and that's why the reds are not showing up, because it's more blue than having the reds in it.
Well, it's on the cool side after the channel swap. Prior to the channel swap, you got lots of reds in here,
Yeah,
and those selected color adjustments probably will affect the sky and the reflection quite a bit. You can see
I
they do. That selective color especially has a fairly substantial effect. Because we've taken away the channel swap. So now adjusting the reds makes a bigger difference. But if we add back that channel swap, then adjusting the reds doesn't have a large effect. But the hue saturation still does, because that affects all the colors. Anyhow, so that's where that aerochrome adjustment takes us. And then I can go back to what the black and white image did. And now let's actually put that, let's change the blend mode of that black and white image to luminosity.
oh boy, does that bring your glow out.
That changed
Yeah.
things a lot, yes. It
That really brings the.
kept the colors,
Whoa,
but
yeah,
it changed the tonal values an enormous amount.
certainly does.
It brings back, it basically takes all that drama we got in the black and white conversion
Yeah.
and applies it to the color. And then if we activate the aerochrome group, we now get that applied to those colors, and that looks very ugly. to my
It really works, that really works.
But it certainly has a large effect. I think back off that black and white layer
I think so, yeah.
and apply just a little bit of it using opacity adjustments. And you may find something in here you like. I like that drama, so I'd rather keep it in place. But you can see now by adjusting just the luminosity with that black and white layer, you're getting different effects. And I'm spanning the whole range from 0 to 100%.
I love that sky, but I also love the glow. So somehow
Yeah.
perfect marriage needs to happen.
Yep. So anyhow, that's the power of layers.
Yeah.
And as I say, between blend modes and opacity adjustments, you can just do all kinds of crazy wild things with
Selected
layers.
color between yellow and
And
red.
I strongly encourage you just to play around with it.
A bit.
Yeah.
Just play around with it, because you'll be surprised. So Mark, what I'll do is I'm gonna save this image as I've got it right now on the thumb drive, and then we're gonna turn to Tim's.
That sounds great.
But this is a starting point for what you might want to do other than getting rid of that dust
I think
spot.
Tim's-
So let me go ahead and save it.
Sure.
Save it as a TIFF. Oh, I'm gonna have to change the name so I don't overwrite the original conversion. Just add a 1 to the file name. And again, we're gonna use zip compression on everything.
And it's Mac.
Oh, well, it's okay. I think Photoshop will still. Photoshop
It's
should, I'm
gonna
pretty sure
blow up.
Photoshop will still read it.
It's gonna say, what's this PC thing doing on it?
I'm pretty sure Photoshop will read it either way. Okay, so, Mark, here's your thumb drive.
We got time.
Yeah, we can take a few minutes. Okay, now I'm plugging in Tim's thumb drive here. And let's see, we still have mine. I'm gonna go to Bridge first of all.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll just use Photolab since that's how I'll do the conversion anyway, probably.
If there's only one raw file on there, there's a couple couple Photoshop. Any.
Oh, okay, yep. All right, so what are we looking for? We're looking for the USB drive and again. That's interesting. It's not finding any images on that drive. I can try using Bridge. Hang on, see if it finds anything there, but there doesn't appear to be an image on there. Let me go to File Explorer and just see. This is a PC. Oh, it's actually not detecting the drive itself. It gave me a message which said, please insert. Oh, here, now it's working. Nope, and then it went away. I don't understand.
It may depend how he formatted his flash drive.
True. I'm gonna plug it. Let's see here. How can I do this? I'm gonna eject my own drive here. Can I do that? Yeah, I should be able to. Actually, I'm just gonna unplug it. I'm just gonna insert it into a different USB port here and see if by any chance that makes a difference. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, okay, now it's reading it. So I think just physically that thumb drive wasn't compatible with this socket. Anywho, there's the NEF. All right. Okay, let's go to Photolab. Now it should see that one. And again, I gotta download a camera body module. We have a D800. Okay. So this is an image with a lot of contrast to it.
It's a sunrise.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, the first thing I'm gonna know, is there any detail under the horizon here? Sorry, it's ocean. Is there any detail in it?
Oh, yeah, there is.
Well, I'm gonna turn on.
To get there, and I don't expect you to get there. I just want to see how you did the conversion from the red. It's really, because it's so red. I just wanted to see what you could do on there.
Now we're starting to see waves in the ocean. That's the beauty of this raw converter. It's basically got a poor man's HDR capability built in. So I can bring out all that detail in the shadows, the deep shadows in that ocean by using that. And then this slider here brings out more of that.
Sam, where did you see
Somewhere off the coast of Mexico.
that?
Okay.
It'd be East Coast.
These?
The other question about this one, and actually the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down the highlights selectively here because they are pretty seriously washed out. And we can save it from a bunch of those. And this is considerably more range of adjustment than you can get in Lightroom or Camera Raw, which is why I tend to use this converter most of the time now. We can also bring up even more detail in the ocean if we want to. By doing these shadow and black adjustments. Oh yeah, I can start seeing waves now. But the one observation I'll make about this is very predominantly red. And I don't know if there is much color separation in this image to begin with. I can tweak these color sliders.
It's okay. It's the 790.
790, you got that much.
Oh, well, that's 790 means the cutoff wavelength is outside the visible band. It's into the infrared band. So you're closest to the red end of the visible spectrum, which is what your sensor is designed for. But it's those red pixels that are going to be picking up almost all of your signal with that 790 filter probably. So there really isn't much color information in this image. So yeah, it's a good way to get black and whites. But yeah, we're not going to get color separation here because there just isn't any in the raw file to speak
Well, I
of.
worked on this about almost 2 hours last night. I'll show you the palette file when we're done. But
Okay.
I mean, the Photoshop file.
Okay.
Because it took me a lot of work to get the color in there.
Yeah, and I believe that.
Oh, I was trying.
Tim, do you not use the pick color eyedropper for white balance on the clouds or something?
Okay,
What
hang on. Mary Lisa is trying to say something here, and I didn't hear you. Go ahead and repeat that if you would, Mary Lisa.
I'm curious what would happen if you use the pick color eyedropper on white clouds. If it would.
We can certainly try it, but it's not going to give you much more color separation, I don't think. I'll pick a cloud that isn't perfectly white because those are washed out, but I'll pick one that's in the gray range somewhere. And what it does is it tries to turn that particular color neutral, white or gray. And you'll see it's moved the color sliders by doing that. The blue slider almost to the left extreme, not quite. And it's moved the magenta green slider way down too. But now everything looks bluish, but you still don't see any differentiation of colors here. And that's because there just isn't much in the original raw file.
Well, it's there. I
Oh, I-
managed to get some.
It's yeah, I believe you it's there, but it's subtle. I believe it took you some time to bring it out.
Yeah, they did.
Yep. So I'm going to take away that color balance.
First adjustment in the different colors. To
Yeah.
get that to come
Yeah.
out.
So so as I say, that's my observation about this file. Is that there isn't a lot of color to work with, color
Yeah.
separation here to work with. Are you interested in going farther with it? Is
No.
there something else you'd like to try?
That's just what I prefer.
Yeah.
Go to my thumb drive and just bring up my Photoshop file.
Okay, let's see here. I'm gonna have to get out of this in that case and go back to Bridge. Or actually I can just go to
It's the top one. Right
this one there, that PSD.
Yes,
Okay,
that's it.
let's see. I should be able just to get right here and get it to open.
Oh, yeah. A little dramatic, but
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I do see there's the PSD. Let's open it in Photoshop.
I was just playing with it. I was really wanting to get those rays coming down.
Yeah. Yep, well, you got them.
Yeah.
And you did achieve some color separation between the ocean and the sky. Did you actually artificially add color to that, or did you just?
I did a radiant filter, mask, radiant mask on the bottom.
Oh, okay. Oh, gradient, yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. So you added some color to the ocean there
Yes.
basically to get those waves looking blue. But yeah, as you can see, there are sort of yellows and reds in the sky, but those are very close to each other in the spectrum.
That's about the best I could do.
Yeah, yeah. I believe it, but it's nice. I mean, you got something out of it, and
Yeah.
I know that was a bit of a struggle.
That that's for that.
Well-
You're gonna go for use that as that for to get to.
Viewing into the sun is an interesting endeavor as well.
That's why I wanted to experiment with
Yeah.
different things, just to see what, I wanted to go through all my lenses, and I did go through all my lenses. This one was the 7200 Nikon f4.
Yeah.
And yeah, the thing I'll say about it, and which we've already touched upon, yes, it's very dramatic, no question about that.
Well, I
But-
tried backing that off, and it just looked worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing about this image that makes it a bear to work with is that there are no objects in it that have any color besides the predominant color, which is all the reds in the sunset.
Yeah.
And so all those adjustments that try to give you color separation and depend on color separation just aren't going to work with this image, and you
Yeah.
found that out.
Oh, yeah. But, like I said, this was an experiment to see what it would do.
Mhm.
Well, you came to the diet.
Yeah, that's right. That's the right place.
Yep, well, you've defeated me because
Oh, and that's recorded.
it's an image that I could not extract any native color from.
I understand. That's why I thought. it would be
You found that out yourself.
Yeah, but-
I mean, you do get.
You'll get shades of gray, but very,
This is more interesting.
you can get it to look very dramatic, but, you're not gonna, using those color sliders, they're not gonna make much. Well, you'll slide the luminosity around, but it won't differentiate between one part of the image and another because there is no real color separation in there.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna
Okay.
close that
Yeah.
one then. I think we're done talking about it.
Yeah.
And in fact, we're out of time here now, so let me go back to the slides momentarily. We did demonstrations. I put this slide in here just to encourage people to ask questions as we wrap up, if there are any lingering questions that you want to talk about. If not, let's move on. The next three slides are the same ones I've had in my other packages. They're just all the links and stuff that I put in. I just stuck them in here for reference. So I'm not going to talk about those. Our next session, I have a homework assignment, and that's because our next session is the session where we're going to talk about images. I want every one of you to bring at least one image to talk about, and bring 2 or 3 others if you can. I strongly recommend that, request that, because want to have some backups, and hard to know how much time we'll spend talking on any particular image. So we want to have more than one from each of you to talk about. But remember, choose the one you want to talk about first, at least. Maybe one that you're proud of, or one that you had trouble with, whatever you want. But choose one to talk about first, and we'll make a point of talking about all of those. And then on a time available basis, we'll move on to others as well. I also encourage you to post your images on the website. I sent the links for that SmugMug page that Bob Kinney has set up. And I'd like to see images popping up there. I know some of you have started sharing some images there, and I'm glad to see that. So there's your homework assignment. And my last point on here is adios. See you next time.